Hello, good morning, good evening, and good afternoon. I'm Jenn Sanasie here with my co-host Renato Mariotti. We come to you every other week live from CoinDesk's socials and on CoinDesk's website, bringing you the latest and greatest in crypto policy and regulation. Renato, it is fantastic to see you again. How's it been going the last 2 weeks?
It's been a busy time. There's just a lot happening right now. And wow, we are literally on the eve of the crypto roundtable that
Mm-hmm.
Hester Peirce has put together. We've talked about that roundtable with her in the past, but now here we are one day beforehand. It's really where the eyes of the industry are because I think everyone is excited to see exactly what this regulatory framework is going to look like.
Yes, the roundtable is happening tomorrow. It's going to be from 1 to 5 p.m. Eastern Time. We'll be streaming it on CoinDesk. So if anyone is interested in watching that, you can do that on coindesk.com. But Renato and I are going to talk about the ins and outs, what we can expect to hear during that roundtable tomorrow. Renato, as you mentioned, this has been a much anticipated event, not just from the beginning of the year, not just from the inauguration, but I would say for years coming, the industry has been waiting to engage with the SEC in the way that the agency under this new administration has been engaging with the industry. And it's quite remarkable to see it all come to fruition.
That's right. We'll talk a little bit later about the Ripple case, but that came in, I believe, December of 2020. And I think it's fair to say that people in this industry have been waiting since that day or earlier for this moment where we're literally having the government gather stakeholders together from across the industry, people, who are both at issuers, lawyers, and others all together to try to figure out what the rules of the road should be. So it's a very exciting time and really a great time for us to have this conversation.
Of course. Well, our next guest is at one of the firms that I think has been waiting for this kind of engagement with the SEC. He released an article this morning outlining Coinbase's blueprint for regulating digital assets in a new era of regulation. Coinbase Chief Policy Officer Faryar Shirzad joins us now. Welcome to the show.
Thanks, Jen. Good to be here. Renato, good to see you.
Of course, great for you to be here with us. We're talking about this SEC roundtable tomorrow. You, of course, released that article I just mentioned earlier this morning. Talk to us about how you're feeling, and I'm curious to hear about how business has changed behind the scenes at Coinbase. I think Coinbase was one of the first firms to say, we're trying to engage with the regulator. We're kind of being hit by a brick wall. That's all kind of changed right now. And there's a new way of engaging with the regulator. How's that changed how you operate?
Well, it's been extraordinary and it's been a real privilege. You may recall, like in 2022, we put out a petition for rulemaking with the agency. There's a process that the agency has, like a lot of others do, where stakeholders, the public can essentially file a petition and ask the agency to consider making rules or clarifying a particular area. And what we did is we laid out about 48 questions that we asked the agency to consider, to put out for public comment, all designed to deal with the full life cycle of how the securities markets operate. And we thought there were a series of questions that the agency should ask on how to modernize the securities regulations to accommodate this new technology. Now, they ignored that. We had to go to the court and all the rest. But what's happened in the 2 years, almost 3 years since, is that we've had an election, and now you have this crypto task force, and you have had this extraordinary door opening on the part of Hester Peirce and acting chair Ueda to ask all of us in the industry to share our thoughts. And so we filed yesterday and issued a blog post on it this morning on what we thought the agency should think about as they begin the process of figuring out how to accommodate this new asset class, this new technology under the existing framework of rules that they operate under.
So one thing that's prominent in that letter that you sent to the SEC is the discussion of where the divide should be between securities and commodities.
Yeah.
That's not important in other countries as important, let's say in the UK, but in the United States, of course, that's an important distinction because we have two regulators that are in this space, right? We have the SEC and the CFTC. Can you explain for our viewers and listeners exactly where Coinbase sees that divide being struck in this new regulatory framework?
Well, Renato, you're exactly right to flag the issue. every other market in the world, except for maybe one or two exceptions, has a single market regulator. And so when the political leadership of a country says, hey, there's a new technology like crypto, let's figure out how to accommodate it into our financial system and how to regulate it, they ask one regulator to figure it out. In the US, because we have such a fragmented regulatory system, the answer to that question begins to transcend jurisdictional lines between agencies, and it becomes really, really hard for any one agency to figure it out. And so a lot of the litigation that you've seen that the industry has been engaged in over the last 3 years has been built around this exact question. What should the SEC regulate? What should the CFTC regulate? And what are the characteristics of a crypto token and the transactions underlying it that potentially allow the SEC, for example, to have jurisdiction? And so the process that Commissioner Persis started in our letter contributes to is answering the basic fundamental question of token classification. And we are grateful that, Commissioner Persis decided to start with such a core issue, and that's going to be the subject of the discussion tomorrow.
I know that there were 36 recommendations put forward by Coinbase. If you had to pick one that is the most important to you as we head into this roundtable tomorrow, what one would that be?
Well, I think the thing they most have to do is deal with this question of token classification. When does the SEC deem a particular token to be have securities-like characteristics and therefore be subject to the securities rules? And I think that's the one sort of point of clarification that has to be made in the process in front of us. And we're appreciative that I think the leadership of the agency and the staff, frankly, know that they have to do that. The opportunity, though, and we talk about this in our letter, is that for all the importance of figuring out what the perimeter of jurisdiction is around the crypto asset markets as we currently know them, which are about a $3 trillion market, there's a $100 trillion broader capital market that has the opportunity to be made much more resilient, much more efficient, much more accessible by adopting tokenization technology. And that's part of what we tried to do in the letter. We say, if nothing else, let's get the rules right on when a crypto token should be treated as a securities transaction. And then let's do the more ambitious thing and figure out how we bring this technology in to make our markets operate better, more efficient, and make sure that the U.S. is the capital market leader of the world, even as other countries move ahead to figure out how to bring this technology into their systems.
One thing that you spoke about in the submission to the SEC is the importance of collaboration between those two agencies for obvious reasons, right? We don't want them to have an inconsistent approach. Help us understand how you foresee entities like Coinbase that might be regulated by both agencies handling that. In other words, would you have, let's say, a CFTC registrant and an SEC and a separate entity that's regulated by the SEC? Just help us understand how, in an ideal world, that would work from your perspective.
Yeah, it's a really important question. And again, this is something that other jurisdictions don't have to deal with because they have a single regulator, and it's much less complicated in figuring out which entity does what activity. In the US, you really have to figure it out. So what the legislation that Congress is considering right now will do, we expect, is to give the CFTC the authority to regulate the crypto commodity spot markets. And so most proposals envision having the same structure that you have in the current commodities, derivatives, and futures market. So an FCM, a DCM, and a DCO, so a clearinghouse, a broker, and an exchange registration. And you could trade in the cash markets using sort of the same entity structure that you have in the derivatives markets. The question for the SEC is, what entity do you need, and where is the venue for trading a crypto security or a token that has the characteristics of a security and therefore subject to the securities rules? And then what do you do when you need to do side-by-side trading of an asset, for example, that may not yet have reached full decentralization and should be traded on a SEC regulated entity, but then will transition to a CFTC regulated entity? So it all gets a bit complicated unless you're sort of deep into these issues. But the short answer is the two agencies need to figure out how to develop a collaborative process where you could have crypto securities and crypto commodities potentially traded on the same venue, subject to the oversight of the two agencies in a way that effectuates the goals that we all share, which is protecting end users, protecting investors, making sure the markets operate with integrity. And I think there's a way to do that.
I know we have limited time with you, and we do want to talk about a recent development for Coinbase getting regulated to offer its services in India. Just because we're talking about the process here in the United States, talk to us about some of the differences in getting that license to operate in India. I know India has been one of the stricter jurisdictions when it comes to offering crypto services there.
Well, India is a good object lesson. And it actually, if you think about it, over the last, maybe 6 to 8 weeks, Coinbase was able to get its full registration in the UK. UK has always been a very large market, but we're now a registered crypto asset service provider in the UK rather than serving it from an outside entity. We were able to get our FIU registration in India, which is essentially their AML registration. And then we were able to get our crypto license in Argentina. And so what that tells you is different markets are moving aggressively to accommodate and companies like us who want to build a business under the appropriate regulatory authorization. And so we're very, very excited that the U.S. is moving ahead to do this, and we're very excited to be in the Indian market. So we now are going to be very shortly in a position to launch the Indian business formally. It'll be under the supervision of the federal national government there. They're still trying to develop their crypto framework, but we've now cleared the hurdle necessary to be able to offer our services there. And with 1 billion plus people in a market like that, it puts us well on the way to achieve Brian Armstrong's vision of bringing 1 billion people on chain, and we're excited to have that opportunity.
So one last question, because I know we're very short on time with you. I'll make it very quick. Obviously, there's been a lot of discussion regarding the Bitcoin Strategic Reserve or Digital Asset Strategic Reserve. Obviously there's been some recent developments there. What does Coinbase foresee the role of that strategic reserve, and what's your view on some of the recent developments there have been?
I think it's a huge historical recognition by our government that Bitcoin in particular is a strategic asset that it's broad and wide adoption around the world. 500 million people, maybe something on that order, owning Bitcoin. Institutional investors, retail investors across all geographies are embracing it. And I think the fact that the U.S. has very large reserves and is going to now, under the president's executive order, take a much more strategic approach to managing its reserves is really exciting. As you may know, we do work with a number of federal agencies, including the Marshal Service, to help the federal government manage their crypto assets that they obtain through seizures, civil and criminal seizures. And we are the custodian of choice for most large entities. And so we obviously can play a role in this. We're happy to do it, but we're much more focused on the strategic significance of what the president has done and what it means for the reality that the adoption has reached an inflection point, and it now matters, and national and government policy should recognize that.
Faryar, thanks so much for joining us today. As always, it's been a pleasure.
Great. Thanks for having me on, guys. Good to talk to you.
That was Coinbase Chief Policy Officer Faryar Shirzad. All right, we are going to continue talking about the developments at the SEC. Renato, I know we chatted a little bit with Faryar about it. We chatted a little bit about what's going to happen at the roundtable tomorrow at the top of the show. But what do you expect to happen? And how can we take these roundtables and summits that you and I talk about so often and actually create actionable items out of them, right? It feels a lot like we're talking a lot about what should happen, which is what we've done for the past how many years. Talk to me about how you make sense of this and what should happen next.
Great question. One thing I was trying to do with Faryar is try to boil down some of these really complicated legal issues and regulatory issues into something that's digestible for somebody watching this just on YouTube or on our socials here on X or someplace else. And it's hard, but because this is a pretty complicated area. But I think the big question that's going to be discussed tomorrow is how are these two big regulators, the SEC and the CFTC, going to work together? One thing that everyone should take away from the conversation that we were having with Faryar a moment ago is the CFTC is not going anywhere. It sure looks like it's going to still exist. And say whatever you want about how other countries do it, that's how the United States is regulating this. And in other contexts, usually it's often very clearly defined whether something is a security or commodity. No one questions that Apple stock or Coinbase stock is a security, and no one really questions that a futures contract or a particular spot trading of let's say natural gas or something is a commodity. So here, as Faryar talked about, you may literally have tokens starting in one regulatory regime, SEC, going to the other, the CFTC. So it's going to require an interconnectedness between those two agencies, a level of cooperation, and a nimbleness that our government has not always shown. And so I think it's going to be a fascinating conversation. I'm looking forward to watching it. I'll be tuned into CoinDesk to see exactly what the discussion looks like tomorrow.
Well, you and I spoke about this on our last show, was this element of more confusion that potentially gets introduced with more clear regulatory frameworks because of the way that the government in the United States is structured. And something that we didn't get to ask Faryar, but once we get more clear regulatory frameworks from a federal level, are firms like Coinbase, are firms like Ripple going to potentially see the same problems come through from different regulators? I know we spoke about this on the last show, but I think it's important to bring up again.
Yeah, I agree. It is very important. So first of all, there's as Faryar talked about, there's legislation going through Congress. That's going to have an interplay with these rules. In other words, Hester and her team and everyone at the SEC and CFTC can come up with rules, but ultimately, at the end of the day, Congress is going to pass laws, and the president's going to sign those laws, and that's going to have some interplay with what rules can be promulgated by the agency. So that's the first thing. But then, of course, we also have state regulators. And we talked a lot about this last time because it's such an important topic. I think many people who are watching this are familiar with the New York TFS, right? Where they are taking a pretty aggressive role in regulating the crypto industry. There are other regulators as well. California, there's a bill in Illinois that is trying to regulate anyone doing business with Illinois residents, which is most crypto products. So all in all, I think we're going to see a lot of different regulators trying to regulate this space, and a lot of lawsuits and litigation about the authority of these state regulators. We talked last week, for example, about Kalshi and already in a fight with Nevada about its sports offerings and so forth.
All right, we're going to talk about another Kalshi development in just a moment. But something else I wanted to bring up with you from our conversation that we just had with Faryar was this idea that, once things are made more clear in the United States, will that be almost like a template for other jurisdictions, other countries to look at and start regulating crypto more flexibly or more clearly? Coinbase just announced that they are entering the Indian market. So I guess my question to you is, how closely are other countries or other jurisdictions watching what's happening in the United States, watching the conversations that are happening at roundtables like the one we're going to see tomorrow, and then applying that to their thinking on how they're going to approach the industry?
Really interesting. Really interesting question. In many ways, Jen, this is happening backwards. So the way that things usually work is the United States tends to be out in front. And there are other countries who will innovate. The United States often chooses the best framework from an innovative country that's really out ahead. And then the world quickly coalesces to something that's compatible with what the United States is doing. It's not to say that there aren't other regulatory regimes that have different approaches on in various areas, as Faryar and I talked about. In the UK and other countries, there's no distinction between securities and commodities regulator, for example. But here, what happened was the United States was so far behind. They took such a ham-handed approach. Our country's taking such a ham-handed approach to crypto that other countries have come far ahead. And I think one of the interesting things is going to be whether some of these jurisdictions that were ahead of the United States start adapting rules to make them more congruent with what the U.S. does. I think that's fascinating. Usually that would happen. We'll see whether that happens here, given how far behind the United States has been.
All right, let's talk about another story that kind of embodies the backwards theme. Ripple CEO Brad Garlinghouse said that the SEC is going to drop its appeal in the case against them. The SEC has not yet commented on this, but wow, we have really been following this Ripple story for years now. So just let's start here, Renato, for our audience who maybe haven't been following Ripple and the SEC as closely as the two of us have. Talk us through some of the major legal milestones that came out of the SEC Ripple case.
Wow, great question. We've talked a lot, Jen, about the SEC's case against Coinbase. We had Paul Grewal on here and so on. But really, Ripple was the front line. It was the opening salvo of the SEC. I believe that the suit was filed in December of 2020. And so this really they were in the guns early. They had to have a very substantial legal fight. And I really think the entire industry rallied around them. There were a lot of what's called amicus filings, where people were filing things in support of Ripple in this litigation, and it was very hotly contested. And what you had here was, for the first time, a substantial defeat for the SEC in crypto. And essentially what happened was the judge in the motion for summary judgment issued a split decision. And now, obviously, Ripple would have liked to won everything, but essentially what the judge said was that large sales of XRP to institutional investors were securities. And the lawsuit was about, I should say, that Ripple did not register register these as securities offerings. So the judge said sales to institutional investors are securities, but the aftermarket sales on exchanges like Coinbase are not. Those are not securities transactions, which was a very substantial win for Ripple. That's up on appeal. And in the last moments, I think January 15th, last moments of the Biden administration, the SEC filed in the Court of Appeals saying the district court got it wrong. The trial judge got it wrong and should have went with the SEC on everything. And that, I think, is why we've seen this settlement take longer than some of the others. What I mean is, in these cases where the SEC filed a lawsuit and not a lot happened, and there wasn't a decision yet, there was just some motions that went back and forth. It was easy to settle because the SEC could just drop the suit. But here, the question is now, that judicial opinion, which neither side completely agreed with at the time, is now the law, at least in that jurisdiction. And obviously, it's just one judge proclaiming that. And I think ultimately, there were reports. I have no private information, just based publicly. There are reports that was a thorny issue. But at the end of the day, it appears that got worked out. The breaking news, I think it was yesterday or today, was that announcement that this will be settled. And I think it's a real important milestone for the industry as a result.
Are there any complications with these settlements, these cases being dropped before we have clear regulatory frameworks? Like, may there be firms that are currently being scrutinized by the SEC that can look at this and take some information away and use that in their fight against them? Are we almost jumping the gun here?
Well, it's a great question. I mean, I think that the SEC. In an ideal world, the SEC would be ready to roll out a new regulatory framework at the same time that it's dropping these suits. Right now, I think there's a lot of uncertainty. A lot of people are waiting and looking to the government to tell them what the rules of the road are going to be. There's legitimate concern and criticism that right now there are none, because the SEC and other federal regulators have been dropping suits, and yet there's no new framework yet. But I think that's why this is such an interesting time for us to have this show, because we're in the midst of this change, in this flux, and so trying to make sense of these changing headwinds is something we all have to do it as an industry, so that this way we're able to adapt.
Yeah, the I guess complicated part for me is what we were talking about with Faryar. We still need a framework to determine what's a security and what's a commodity, right? This lawsuit had to do with XRP, and there, like you said, there was this partial judgment on it being a security in one instance, but not in another. But since we don't have that framework, like how do we deem XRP with all of this information coming at us? Am I right to say that we just don't know yet?
Yeah, that's right. I was on a panel, just a couple months ago with some luminaries in the industry, and I was asked by someone in the audience how you define a security in this context, and it was complicated. And part of the reason why is there aren't judicial opinions on it. This decision that I was referring to, summary judgment decision in the Ripple case, was one of the only ones. And of course, it's only a decision by one judge in Manhattan. It doesn't have any controlling precedential value outside of that context, but it's one of the first decisions out there, and it's not being replaced by a decision of the Court of Appeals. The Court of Appeals now will never consider the issue. So if the federal regulators didn't lay out a framework, we would be in bad shape here. We'd be worse off. But I think everyone expects that to happen, that we're all going to be, have our eyes on the CoinDesk feed tomorrow, so that we can watch the roundtable, and we're all looking in the halls of Congress to make sure that Fit 21 and the stablecoin bill and other bills get passed this year.
All right. Yes. A reason for this show to exist for the foreseeable future, Renato. Now, I am excited about our last story because March Madness is here and I filled out my bracket today. I don't know if you are participating in any brackets, Renato. Are you?
I have not this year. I have not this year. My clients are gambling enough. Speaking of that, speaking of gambling, right?
Yeah, speaking of gambling, you and I have talked a lot about prediction markets on this show, and prediction markets as it pertains to sports contracts. We can see the story up here. So Robinhood has rolled out a prediction markets component in collaboration with Kalshi for now, and they are offering sports betting contracts. Now, if you didn't see the show 2 weeks ago, we spoke about Nevada. Kind of demanding Kalshi not offer services to folks who want to participate in sports betting in the state. Now we have Kalshi partnering with Robinhood, a big mainstream platform. Talk to me about what's going on here, Renato, from a legal perspective.
Sure. So event contracts, have not really been legal, particularly in the sports context, but beyond. And we I think have chronicled on the show quite a bit the fight Kalshi had with the CFTC late last year, which allowed them to roll out political event contracts, which became a major thing, like number one in the App Store kind of thing. But here, there's this effort to go into sports, and I think this is a big move. I am hearing a lot of chatter. A lot of people are asking me about this right now, Jen, and it's because Robinhood's a big player. Kalshi's a smaller startup, but Robinhood sees this as an opportunity. They know exactly what they're doing. So what are they doing here? Well, their event contracts can compete with and may outcompete or displace traditional sports betting. And here's what I mean. An event contract is essentially, critics would call it a bet. You're essentially trying to, you have a contract that it pays out depending on an outcome in the future. Like, I don't know, Duke and how they do in a particular game in March Madness, right? And if you are betting on Duke to win a game or Duke to win by more than 8 points or whatever you might be, that looks an awful lot like a sports bet. The difference is, among other things, it's not regulated by all of these state gaming boards. So all the traditional folks doing sports betting are dealing with all sorts of regulations and rules and potentially fees and taxes that the Robinhoods of the world are not. Secondly, second issue I will just note is that there are advantages to the event contracts that traditional betting doesn't have. If you bet on Duke to win the national championship this year and they make it to the Final Four, you can't easily back out of that bet if you make that bet at a traditional sports book. But you could sell your contract at any point when they hit the Elite Eight or Final Four or whatever. So the institutional players are concerned, the states are concerned, and I expect this to be a big fight going forward, a legal fight going forward.
It sounds like it's going to be a big legal fight. I mean, anytime you have these kind of revolutionary shifts to industry that's been around for a long time, I think of, Uber and taxi services. There always is a legal fight, right? Because there is so much at stake for so many different parties. The last time you and I spoke, you said that you thought we might see the CFTC carve sports betting out of their guidance. Now, with Robinhood, such a major player offering these contracts, do you think that's going to change anything? Do you think we might see the CFTC probing for more information here?
Very interesting question. That's a good one, Jed. So when we last spoke, there's going to be a roundtable, a prediction markets roundtable at the end of next month, the end of April, that's going to discuss these issues. In full disclosure, I filed a position paper on behalf of a big client, but many of the other position papers were from folks like Native American tribes and so forth, who had obviously very serious concerns about themselves being displaced, their businesses being displaced by this. And the acting chair expressed her federalism concerns on prior occasions. What I believe now, given particularly this huge announcement this week, is that Robinhood, Kalshi, and others plan to litigate this no matter what the CFTC does. So if the CFTC says no to sports, yes to everything else, yes to politics, yes to betting on the Oscars, and I put betting in quotes, but yes to event contracts and the Oscars or whatever, then I expect Kalshi to litigate that and Robinhood and others to litigate that in court. And just like they're going to litigate against Nevada. So we're going to have a lot to cover in the months ahead. But I think, but I think it's going to determine the future of these industries.
Yeah. I mean, like we always say, so much happening. It bring us back to the basics here. When it comes to prediction markets, they really are so new. They really took off based on the last election here in the United States. Are there any protections for users who participate in these products right now?
Well, that's a big question. I mean, there isn't a regulatory framework built around event contracts. In fact, that's what the CFTC is
Working
to
on.
do. There are general laws that prevent things like fraud and so on. But I do think there's definitely a buyer beware element to it at this point. I feel the same way about something like meme coins. We talked about meme coins, I think, on prior episodes. There was a statement that the SEC put out saying they're like collectibles, like baseball cards or Beanie Babies. And, you can't commit fraud with Beanie Babies or baseball cards. You can't commit fraud with meme coins either. And somebody, whether it's a state AG or others, may go after you. But essentially what the SEC was saying there is this is not our focus. And right now, until this gets the rules of the road get set, I think there's going to be less activity by the CFTC given the uncertainty, and so you need to be more careful. If you are going to be engaging in purchases and sales of event contracts in the short run.
All right, we'll have to wait and see. That roundtable that the CFT is holding is in April, you said, right?
End of April, we're told. Yes, this week.
All right.
We're told that.
All right. Well, we'll just have to wait and see what comes out of that. But I can imagine that Kalshi and Robinhood are just going to keep trucking along all the way through March Madness.
I think that's a safe bet. And, once these things pick up steam and a lot of users flock to that, that can make it more give an incentive, more of an incentive for a fight, not only in the courtroom and litigation, which you talked about, but also a fight in the halls of Congress, and making views known to regulators. So I think there's that event contracts will have a transformative impact on a number of industries. That's a space I'm very much focused on. As probably anyone who's watched this show knows, because I kind of keep chronicling it, and that's because I see how radically transformative those event contracts will be now that it appears to be. It looks very likely that we'll have a regulatory framework in a matter of months.
Well, we'll keep an eye on that right here on this show. Thank you, Renato, for doing this with me. It is always a pleasure. And thank you to our audience who tunes in every other week to hear us discuss, debate, get more information on policy and regulation in this industry.
Absolutely. And stay tuned. Next week, we're going to have a lot of in 2 weeks, we're going to have a lot of news coming out of this roundtable and more, because it seems like there's always new developments on a week-by-week basis in this industry.
I know, never a dull moment. All right. Thank you, everyone, for watching our show. We are here every other week on CoinDesk socials, on CoinDesk's website. We have a lot of great guests join us, from representatives from the SEC, the CFTC, legal and policy departments at some of the biggest crypto firms. So please tune in. We are following the discussion and following the progress made here in the United States and abroad. I am Jenn Sanasie. That is my co-host, Paul Hastings' partner, Renato Mariotti. We will see you next time.